Okay, thank you again for being here. We are going to start with Mario Chard. Mario is the author of Land of Fire, winner of the Dorset Prize and the Georgia Author of the Year Award in Poetry. Recent poems have appeared in The Nation, The New Yorker, Poetry, and Elsewhere. Winner of the Discovery Poetry Prize and a former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. He lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Mario. It's great to see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Gwen and Adam, for having me back. It wasn't very long ago. I'm a recent alum, so I was really excited about the opportunity to read there. So I thought I would read some new poems from this second collection in progress, and I also thought I would read poems that sort of speak to the season for different traditions in which we celebrate, we think of, we remember, we perform as the dead, and maybe a few spooky poems, we'll see. But this first is a fable, and it's really born of this idea that, well, many, but I think the image had its origin in the old big toy that we used to have at elementary school. I don't think they make big toys for elementary school children anymore that are as dangerous as the old ones. And I don't know if it's the same without the threat of breaking an arm or a leg, but this is a tale about the big toy. The poem is Child in Big Toy. They were calm because it had never happened before, because they thought it must have, when designed, a tunnel to fit the child, but not the adult. Then how if a child crawled there and curled and closed her mouth? How to get the child out? Send another in. Send in someone small. They were calm because everyone finds reasons to be calm. When there's wind or sun or this coat at the base of the slide, it must be the child's. Come out, you're fine, come on now, come out. They were wrong. All of them were wrong. Some thought asa, some thought calm down. They were getting somewhere with their thoughts. Part of the crowd grew angry with the other part for making a crowd. So one crawled up into the tube until his chest stopped like his breath and he saw something wrong. The sun made blue in the tube, something about the sun and scuff marks from shoes. The crowd saw the half of him left out kick, then kick wild, so they pulled the other half out. They sat him up and someone groaned. Someone said, enough now, come on, sweetheart, enough, come out. Then another crawled inside, left her coat by the slide, passed the marks, saw the blue, smelled the plastic in her mouth that comes from plastic, having caught the sun at noon, the burning, soon night cooled, 1,000 black mark tallies to tell the cycle of shoes, then wider shoes of older children pressed inside by two to touch and make the space between them small. This one heard a sound. Someone's calling me, she thought. I'm found. So she crawled back, remembered all, moved aside. Another tried, lost. Another tried. I have to be honest that I'm sincerely grateful that I'm trying to be more grateful. That's not why I'm grateful. I'm trying to be more grateful because this October is not the same as last October. I'm just grateful that I'm not, and we're not living in the election anymore. But I wanted to read a poem that is a kind of nightmare poem, but it was about the election from 4 years before last year. And this is not a fable. It's called The Elect. We praise the cheap drop ceiling and not the mural on the walls of the High Point Christian Church nursery for proffering mercy. for the way its plainness saved our eyes from having to meet the gaze of human faces painted where animal faces should be. Nightmares to the child plotting her escape from any academy, let alone the school of Christ, suffering the children to play under scenes depicting that first garden we lost, and where, in their version, we crawled like cartoon hybrids of the locusts John the Revelator later dreamed, shapes of horses, bared teeth of lions, scorpions, hair of women, wings. We braved that hall, a line that curled inside so long that all were forced to pass and let their shoulders brush their neighbors, walking back to reach where they had arrived a half hour before to vote. No one spoke. What ended that night, besides the line, was the paint of Eden slathered up, then stopped. Instead of sky, treetops branched to ceiling tiles, turned back to canvas the brush ignored, sign to the generations caged inside that their world, if touched, was always painted walls. I've been writing poems that are palindromic, or some of them strict palindromes, but I fear that mode can be a gimmick too quickly. And I wanted to also write an elegy for a neighbor. His name was Otto, O-T-T-O. And Otto, and later in his life, had Alzheimer's, and that's what took him. But he was an important figure, formative figure in my childhood. And so when writing this poem in the I wanted each line to be a palindrome, but that became tedious quickly. So I only have the first line of each stanza as a palindrome, which is helpful as a generative form. But in this case, it suddenly became an elegy. It's a double elegy. It's an elegy for my father as well. And I didn't intend that, but I don't think we can have any control on the dead or where they appear. So this is Otto. You kept the sound that kept you sprawled. In that space, our thrifted rug once replaced with rose-toned herringbone shapes you had rolled when I found you. Leaned against the fireplace like a shovel once the hole is dug. Dug, but I was his son. Our faces won by blunted spade, atrophic brain, the excavation of. Young father, when my father, young, crossed in sprint a cropless field and floodplain at the whale, watched you leave the riverbank to wade where your daughter left, find her body without breath, saw you take her place, then fail, her chest, inflate, then only reflect the heft and shape like changeling theft. Trained by cord to tell the trains apart that cried through every town, you made a basement model track to run back time. Miniature streets of sentinel pines, then locked us out. Neighbor kids, too grown to drown or question signs, trouser stains, choked bouts of rage. Your windows, constant lamplight, faintest chime. Last years of disease would outlast the man who loomed across the ditch where our lawns met, who taught me how to whistle with my hands, focus breath, a distant horn, lament, to call your body lost from gardens, found in basements you climbed into, like the baths your wife called dug, to lift you out of near the end. Otto, I keep what I ought to let age of you, of Doug who followed. The sight of both laid under town, your trains with one face bound to either end like Janus, like the brain gone looking for home, the river road, sound. We forget another mouth is whistling ahead. Palindrome. This is a short, spooky poem, and then I'll have one more. Bargaining. On the counter, I mistake a shadow for a stain. I bargained as a child with the demon that came while others slept, that it could exist if I never knew it was there, that it could drink from cups I stacked in the sink, rest if it always left the same small pattern in the folds of a chair. Everywhere, I mistake a presence for permanence. I am ashamed of the bargain, aware that I made it. Break it, the demon says, and I still break it. And this, again, my last poem. Thank you so much for letting me read, for listening. This is, again, another, a kind of palindromic form that really wants as its last line to repeat the title and then repeat the poem over again. And I found, as I said before in the previous reading, that space between the title and the text of the poem is a kind of space, is a kind of silence that interests me. The poem is Rhyme. Body, teach my mind to age. Rage has taught me nothing. Pain has taught me only to rage at pain. Blame has taught me nothing, but I still blame. Here lies one taken in their prime. Body, teach my mind to bury prime, where I have buried rage, above blame and pain, above age and mind and body, time. Before that word, their one repeated ending makes, remains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. That was terrific. And I apologize, I must have thrown you all off. We were supposed to start with Audrey. My excuse is that Audrey is for some reason listed at the bottom on the website, which I was reading off of. So now I will correct that. And Audrey will be next. I'm delighted to welcome Audrey Cephali. Her plays include The Gulf, Alabaster, Maytag Virgin, The Last Wide Open, The Story of Walter, and Love is a Blue Tick Hound. She is a DGF traveling master. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you. I'm privileged and delighted to be here. That was incredible, Mario. So moving. I guess I'm glad I chose the piece that I did tonight to read to you, because it feels like it's some of the more lyrical of the pieces that I've worked on. And actually this one is, I'm going to be reading three cuttings from, sorry, let me mute that. Three cuttings from a piece of mine called The Story of Walter. I write stories and plays about lonely people. And I wanted to create this portrait of this lonely single father. And he's out in the world and he's doing the best that he can, but he's like, you know, he's like a Mr. Cellophane. And I think that'll come through in this first section here. The story actually first appeared as a podcast, which you can actually still listen to on iTunes or Stitcher, I think on Spotify also. And I've currently have adapted it as I'm working on the stage adaptation now. So the first piece is called Vanishing. Walter sat at the DMV tapping his expired driver's license against the side of his seat. He thought back to 4 years prior when he was here last to have his license renewed. It was at this moment he realized he was wearing the exact same regrettable tan-colored button-down shirt as the one from before. His wardrobe, curatorially speaking, ran the entire spectrum, a staggeringly comprehensive and formidably inert study of the color brown. His standing objective, after all, was of course to attain the slightest thread count known to man in the most highly forgettable tint. The combined strength of such an assemblage, at least in nearly all of his preliminary tests, rendered him utterly invisible to most women, asshole children, and door-to-door canvassers. He looked up to see a young woman staring at him. Had she read his mind? That shirt? Again? Really? He smiled at her weakly, but her expression did not change, and he understood that she was not, in fact, staring, but simply lost in thought. He tried to reconcile the opposing logic. At once, the confusing idea that a woman would choose his face for any activity at all, passive or otherwise, and the all-affirming observation that she had chosen his face as the stopping off point for a daydream about something so flatly uninteresting that she'd forgotten she was staring in the first place. His life in a nutshell. He may as well be wallpaper. Walter sat in front of the white wall. He handed the clerk his old license and paperwork. He straightened his back and raised his chin as instructed. The clerk focused the camera and clicked twice. Silence. Do you see me? Walter asked. Sit over there, the clerk said. We'll call you when it's ready. Walter stared at the clerk, who had now moved on to laminating the license from the previous customer. You're very good with people, he said. To feel utterly insignificant, Walter knew of no place better than the Department of Motor Vehicles. Here you could be ignored in all sorts of ways, with new ones being invented all the time. He looked around at all the sad, empty faces. Not a single person was happy here, except for one. Walter smiled at the little boy across from him who was scissoring his legs wildly, sucking on a Tootsie Roll pop. Do you see me? Walter asked. I see you, the boy replied. You look like the UPS man. The little boy hopped off with his mother shouting, UPS! UPS! Out in his car, Walter sat slumped in the driver's seat staring at his new license and its impressive anti-counterfeit detail. Polycarbonate card body, laser engraving, tactile text. The previous color headshot now replaced with black and white, somehow rendering him, if possible, even more invisible than 4 years prior. He imagined the long line of people, He imagined the long queue of people standing in line to steal his identity, only to politely pass upon further scrutiny. He ran his finger over the photograph. Vanishing. Walter slipped the card into his wallet and looked up at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Was there ever a time he wanted to be seen? 3rd grade, he thought. Mrs. Tipton. How pretty she was in her long linen skirts and cardigan sweaters. He knew. He never knew the scent she wore, but he decided it was roses. He would raise his hand for any reason and sometimes for no reason at all, and she would look at him and smile. Yes, Walter? Nothing, he would say. I forgot the question. This is the next little piece called Chrissy M. We're at a grocery store now. Walter understood about lonely. It was a constant more reliable than anything else in his life. And as a matter of precaution, he managed elaborate risk assessments in his head, which allowed him to head off potentially dangerous social interactions before they became problematic. He knew, for example, that the attractive cashier, Chrissy M, as her name tag suggested, who had once laughed at something he said, some unintentional joke, asked his name and then wanted to know what he did for a living, was on duty at the nearby Safeway fairly reliably every Thursday at 4 p.m. But the prospect of further encounters with Chrissy M. made him so nervous that he began taking deep, calming breaths before entering the store. And then he made a point of always standing in a different lane with his 9 to 12 items. This helped to avoid Express Lane 3 most days, but there was little he could do to predict the days that Chrissy M. might catch him standing in the longer line and direct him to her lane instead. He even took great pains to add 5 to 8 items, putting him well above the margin of allowance for express service. But on at least one occasion, Chrissy M. had instead ushered him through her lane with a wink and a nod, despite his protestations. Her personal attention to him, her sweet, endearing ways, this was not something Walter would ever get used to, would ever allow himself to get used to. After all, no woman who had ever sought out his affection had stuck around for more than a month or two. She would find some reason to put him in the friend zone or quietly drift from his life in order to avoid hurt feelings. Walter preferred binary rejection, something concrete that he could measure. Because in his mind, a woman was either there or she wasn't. After all, in the varying and unpredictable styles of retreat left him puzzles. The maneuvers were stealth, leaving him always in a fog of bewilderment, like the feeling one gets when losing $5, which is a very specific feeling. It's enough of a loss to notice, but not enough of one to cause alarm. In recent years, he began taking what he knew were elaborate precautions to safeguard his own heart. He chose instead, as an example, to enjoy from a safe distance the ineffable sound of Chrissy M.'s laughter, a sensation that he had decided felt like champagne or like delicate finger taps on a leather drum. It filled the air with sparkling things, causing him to close his eyes and smile as if bathing in the new sunlight of spring. It was positively heartbreaking the way he avoided her, busily distracting himself with his receipt while passing by Express Lane 3, so as not to appear rude, but simply preoccupied with his financial affairs. He could feel her eyes upon him. And sometimes she would call his name, and this would send his heart racing. He exhaled sharply and left the syllables behind him as he pushed his cart through the sliding glass door. Nothing to be done, Walter thought, nothing to be done. And then I have one last little passage. This is him and his daughter. This is a little bit about him and his young 7-year-old daughter. She has gone off to school. She's getting on the bus, and he's standing there at the window watching her get on the bus. Walter stood at the window of his unfurnished living room and watched his daughter saunter off toward the group on the corner. Each day he kept count. Would she turn and wave this time? It depended on her mood, he had deduced. Except that sometimes, between the time she bounded down the stairs and reached her crowd of adoring fans on the corner, her mood would somehow miraculously lift. He chose to accept this as a random occurrence versus growing indifference, and was determined to not take it personally. Because after 6 months of her now living with him full-time and him worrying sick, when he never had to worry sick before, he knew that she knew that it comforted him when she made a point to look back over her shoulder. She knew he would be standing there because he was always standing there. And no matter the importance of other things or distractions that might threaten this ritual, until the bus rolled out of sight, he would still be standing there because he never wanted her to make the point of looking back, only to see him not standing there. It was a paradox, and the logic tripped him up at times. In order to see her disappointment, he'd have to be standing there to witness it. And if he was standing there to witness it, then the disappointment of him not being there would be a non-issue. And so it was his overly active imagination about things involving the breaking points of a 7-year-old girl that kept him awake at night. The thing he knew for sure was that if one of them were to have a broken heart, it should be him, because, and not to insult her experience level, definitely not. When it came to broken hearts, he'd simply had way more practice at it. So he had decided that it didn't even matter if she smiled or stared plainly from the corner or even from the bus window, so long as there was something, it would be enough. And if by some good measure of fortune she were to also wave at him in the process, he would sail all the way through lunch. In fact, when he really sat and thought about it, it was remarkable how little he would settle for these days. Is it? Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. That was lovely. Our next reader is Suzanne Feldman. Suzanne is the author of 5 novels, including Absalom's Daughters and Sisters of the Great War. She is the winner of the 2001 Nebula Award for Short Fiction and the Editor's Prize for 2005 at the Missouri Review. She was a Walter Dakin Fellow at Swanee in 2019. Welcome, Suzanne.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. This is almost as good as being back in Tennessee. I'm going to read from my new book, which came out on Tuesday, Sisters of the Great War, which is about 2 sisters who go to basically volunteer for World War I. One as a nurse who wants to be a doctor, and you'll figure out who that is pretty soon. And the other sister, the younger sister, is Elise, who is mechanically inclined and will become an ambulance driver during the war. All the ambulance drivers were women, as the men were all fighting. And so their adventures begin in Baltimore. So this is Baltimore, Maryland, August 1914. Ruth Duncan fanned herself with the newspaper in the summer heat as Grandpa Gerald put up a British flag outside the house. If he'd had her uniform of any kind, he would have worn it. People on the sidewalk paused and pointed, but Grandpa, still a proper English gent, even after almost 20 years in the US, smoothed his white beard and straightened his waistcoat, ignoring the onlookers. "That's done," he said. Ruth's own interest in the war was limited to what she read in the paper from across the dining room table. Grandpa would snap the paper open before he ate breakfast. She could see the headlines and the backside of the last page, but not much more. Grandpa would grunt his appreciation of whatever was inside, snort at what displeased him, and sometimes laugh. On August 12th, the headline in the Baltimore Sun read, "France and Great Britain declare war on Austria-Hungary," and Grandpa wasn't laughing. Cook brought in the morning mail and put it on the table next to Grandpa. She was a round, gray-haired woman who left a puff of flour behind her wherever she went. "Letter from England, sir," Cook said, leaving the envelope and a dusting of flour on the dark mahogany. She smiled at Ruth and left for the kitchen. Grandpa tore open the letter. Ruth waited while he read. It was from Richard and Diane Dowling, his friends in London, who still wrote to him after all these years. They had sent their son John to Harvard in Massachusetts for his medical degree. Ruth had never met John Dowling, but she was jealous of him, his opportunities, his apparent successes. The Dowlings sent letters whenever John won some award or other. No doubt this was more of the same. Ruth drummed her fingers on the table and eyed the dining room clock. In 10 minutes, she would need to catch the trolley that would take her up to the Loyola College of Nursing, where she would be taught more of the things that she had already learned from her father. The nuns at Loyola were dedicated nurses and they knew what they were doing. Some were outstanding teachers, but others were simply mired in the medicine of the last century. Ruth was frustrated and bored, but Father paid her tuition, and what Father wanted, Father got. Ruth tugged at her school uniform, a white apron over a long white dress, which would never see a spot of blood. What do they say, Grandpa? He was frowning. John is enlisting. They've rushed his graduation at Harvard so he can go home and join the Royal Army Medical Corps. How can they rush graduation? Ruth asked. That seems silly. What if he misses a class in, say, diseases of the liver? Grandpa folded the letter and looked up. I don't think he'll be treating diseases of the liver on the battlefield. Anyway, he's coming to Baltimore before he ships out. Here, said Ruth in surprise, but why? For one thing, said Grandpa, I haven't seen him since he was 3 years old. For another, you two have a common interest. You mean medicine? Ruth asked. Oh, Grandpa, what could I possibly talk about with him? I'm not even a nurse yet, and he's a doctor. She spread her hands. Should we discuss how to wrap a bandage? As long as you discuss something. He pushed the letter across the table to her and got up. You'll be showing him around town. Me, said Ruth, but why me? Because your sister, Grandpa nodded at Elise, just clumping down the stairs in her nightgown and bathrobe, has dirty fingernails. He started up the stairs. Good morning, my dear, he said. Do you know what time it is? Uh-huh, Elise mumbled, and she slumped into her seat at the table. As Grandpa continued up the stairs, Ruth called after him, but when is he coming? His train arrives Sunday at noon, Grandpa shouted back. Find something nice to wear. You too, Elise. Elise rubbed her eyes. What's going on? Ruth pushed the letter at her and got up. Read it, she said. You'll see. Ruth made her way down 33rd Street with her heavy book bag slung over one shoulder, heading for the trolley stop 4 blocks away on Charles. Summer classes were almost over, and as usual, the August air in Baltimore was impenetrably hot and almost unbreathable. It irritated Ruth to think that she would arrive at Loyola sweaty under her arms, her hair frizzed around her nurse's cap from the humidity. The nuns liked neatness, modest decorum, not perspiring young women who wished they were somewhere else. Elise, Ruth thought, as she waited for a break in the noisy traffic on Charles Street, could have driven her in the motor car, but no, she'd slept late. Her younger sister could do pretty much anything, it seemed, except behave like a girl. Elise, who had been able to take apart Grandpa's pocket watch and put it back together when she was 6 years old, was a useful mystery to both Father and Grandpa. She could fix the car, cheaper than the expensive mechanics. For some reason, Elise wasn't obliged to submit to the same expectations as Ruth. She could keep her nails short and dirty. Ruth wondered, as she had since she was a girl, if it was her younger sister's looks. She was a mirror image of their mother, who had died in childbirth with Elise. Did that make her special in Father's eyes? An iceman drove a sweating horse past her. The horse raised its tail, grunted, and dropped a pile of manure, rank in the heat, right in front of her, as though to augur the rest of her day. The iceman twisted in the cart to tip his hat. Sorry, sister. Ruth let her breath out through her teeth. Maybe the truth of the matter was that she was the sorry sister. It was at this exact corner that her dreams of becoming a doctor, to follow in her father's footsteps, had been shot down. When she was 10, and the governess said she had done well in her writing and math, she was allowed to start going along on Father's house calls and to help in his office downstairs. Father had let her do simple things at first, mix plaster while he positioned a broken ankle, give medicine to children with the grip, but she watched everything he did and listened carefully. By the time she was 12, she could give him a diagnosis, and she remembered her first one vividly, identifying a man's abdominal pain as appendicitis. You did a good job, Father had said to her as he'd reined old Bess, the horse, around this very corner. You'll make an excellent nurse one day. Ruth remembered laughing because she thought he was joking. Her father's praise was like gold. A nurse, she'd said, one day I'll be a doctor just like you. Yes, a nurse, he'd said firmly, without a hint of a smile. It was the tone he used for patients who wouldn't take their medicine. But I want to be a doctor. I'm sorry, he said. He hadn't sounded sorry at all. Girls don't become doctors. They become nurses and wives. Tomorrow, if there's time, we'll visit a nursing college. When you're 18, that's where you'll go. But he'd shaken his head sharply, cutting her off. It isn't done, and I don't want to hear another word about it. A decade later, Ruth could still feel the shock in her heart. It had never occurred to her that she couldn't be a doctor because she was a girl. And now John Dowling was coming to town to cement her future as a doctor's wife. That was what everyone had in mind. She knew it. Maybe John didn't know it yet, but he was the only one. Ruth frowned and lifted her skirts with one hand, balancing the book bag with the other, and stepped around the manure as the trolley came clanging up Charles. So the book is written in alternating chapters. So there's Ruth and then there's Elise. And this is Elise's chapter, chapter 2. That evening, Elise was hunched over the motor car on Charles Street where the engine had conked out. Father had come home irritated and sent her out after supper to fix it or retrieve it or something, just have it ready for calls the next day. With her stained blue mechanic's apron covering her long dress, Elise peered around, expecting the stares of passers-by. A woman working on a car? She was used to the scorn. Once, while she was driving, someone's snotty brat had thrown a rock at her, missing her, but leaving a little dent in the shining black body of the car. Here, so close to the university, the least she expected was mocking comments from passing fraternity boys. That had happened more than once. In her experience, though, the women were the worst with their silent, judgmental eyes. Elise could almost read their thoughts, almost. When they stared at her, she felt accused of something. Taking a man's job? She wasn't sure. The women put their noses in the air and hustled their children along as though just the sight of her working on a car would somehow scar them for life. At this point, it was so late, hardly anyone was on the street. There were no hecklers, so she focused on the engine again, smelling of gasoline, black with oil. It was barely visible in this dark space between street lamps. She found the fuel line by touch, where the problems with the motor car usually began, and was just detaching it when a shadow fell over the already shadowy engine. She looked up and found herself staring into the amused eyes of a man in a pinstriped suit. "Do you need help, miss?" This happened all the time, too. Men who knew nothing about engines were always ready to dive right in, assuming she was a damsel in distress. "No, thanks," said Elise briskly. "I know what's wrong with it." "It was an empty offer, actually," said the man. "I don't know a thing about motors." He smiled at her. His lips were full and his face round. He had beautiful eyelashes. "You must be quite an expert," he said. Elise made herself look away, back at the grimy innards, the invisible fuel line. "I've been working on this one ever since my father bought it." "Your father's a mechanic?" "He's a doctor," said Elise. "A doctor? Then who taught you what to do?" Elise spared him a glance. Was he flirting with her? That would be a first. "I just watched what the mechanics did." Should she tell him the details? The men laughing as she unscrewed the spark plugs when she was 10, and the subsequent streaks of grease on her sundress. The way father had sold off old Bess and the buggy to the milkman as soon as he was convinced his daughter could fix the car. How the small stable behind the house smelled of gasoline now instead of hay and leather. "Really," she said down into the engine, "I just like to fix things." She wished he would go away. "How extraordinary," said the man in an entirely different tone. "Sweeter, higher, utterly fetching. Maybe you could come and fix my motor car sometime." Elise looked up. At first she wasn't sure. Then her mouth opened as she saw through the him into the her. His, her. Smile widened, and the man, the woman, dressed in a pinstripe suit, grinned. "The thing breaks down all the time. Maybe," she said, "it just needs a loving touch." Elise straightened, wrench in her hand. The back of her neck prickled. The prickle shivered down her spine, lower and lower, until it ended up all funny and tingly. Elise could feel herself blushing deeply in the dark. Do your friends fix cars too? The woman asked. I don't have many friends, Elise replied. And the ones you do have don't understand you, the woman said. She raised an unmistakably suggestive eyebrow. They think you're peculiar. What about your family? My father sent me out to fix, she gestured at the car, the open hood, this. So he at least understands. Understands? Elise asked. You don't have to hide it from him. Hide? Elise repeated. Hide what? The woman let out an easy laugh. Come with me, she said. I'll show you. She turned and started walking away. Hey, Elise shouted. Wait, I can't just leave the car. The woman beckoned, her smile wide and languid, as though every question could be answered just by following. Elise, speechless, looked at the car and then at the pinstripes disappearing into the night. With the wrench still in her hand, she followed. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that with the wrench still in her hand.
You got to have that wrench in Baltimore.
Okay, our last reader tonight is Jason Gray. Jason is the author of Radiation King and Photographing Eden, as well as 2 chapbooks, How to Paint the Savior Dead and Adam and Eve Go to the Zoo. His poems have been featured in Poetry, Kenyon Review, American Poetry Review, Image, and elsewhere. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Leah. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is fantastic. I am so pleased to be reading here tonight with Sawani again. I'm going to start by reading a poem from my first book, Photographing Eden. I was in Shenandoah National Park recently again, for the first time in a long time, and this poem took place there 20 years ago or so, an incident where I saw a black bear. Bear. Along the trail, I drag my shadow behind me as the sun burns into my forehead. The woods of Virginia do not move, except everywhere, slowly. Ahead, the stillness is the same. Even the trees are bending with the weight of air. I've walked for miles and yet seen nothing. No scurryings, only wind howls at cliff edges, where stunted pines like suicides look down. Down into the valley, the light dulls. What's left luminous is the moss in shadow. And in the river basin, among the deadfall, scruff sparks in the brush and out comes a bear, running into the woods. I stand amazed, like darkness exposed to sunlight, an empty bowl to water. The footbeats leave their echoes. Moving on to Radiation King. I'm going to read a few poems from here and then end with a few new ones. The first poem in this book is called Project Faultless and takes its name from an atomic nuclear test that took place in Nevada in the 60s. They were trying to find a new place to test bombs since the Nevada test site was too close to Vegas, and when they set out the bombs, they shook the casinos. And people used to complain, including Howard Hughes. Project Faultless. What hurt to set a little fire here? Hot Creek Valley was Mars to most of the world. This was a test to see if the ground could hold a little bomb in its belly before we gave it a greater tonnage to bear. The ground could not. Faults opened, and the steel bomb tube sunk flush with the dirt, stovepiped 9 feet above the earth. This was the landscape we imagined when we imagined the world post-apocalypse. Barren, cracked, a shell that magma would in time subsume. Atoms really are perfection, tiny movers, brilliant gods, or force of evolution if you prefer. We dreamed the science, pulled apart the facts, made the future a fiction we'd never live. Can you blame us for our triumphs? Soon enough, we'll be irradiated ghosts hiding in abandoned silver mines or narrating from the bunkers. We wanted to be generous. We moved the tests back south. A casino shakes and maybe a sucker gets lucky if the wheel jumps a little. 235, 226. Black, then red, stack, unstack. Then a crashing of chips the dealer sweeps away. Relativity. He took the watch apart. The snowflake gears, too delicate for hands his size, bend and entangle on the table. If only the metal would melt, then maybe so would time. The leather band has faded to a pale urine. The watch had been his father's, worn at the bulge. The gears malfunctioned when he hurled the watch to slow time down. It only stopped. Telomeres clip in ages, but death is not a rabbit pulled from your coat on a crowded subway. I wrote a poem for this as a monologue in the voice of the man who would have hired the women who ended up becoming what were known as the Radium Girls. If you don't know that story, I suggest taking a look at that. It's tragic, but very interesting. US Radium's finest personnel man to the new recruits. US Radium needs you girls for good pay factory work. This is the future, girls, the age of radiation. You'll make all of America's wristwatch dials glow with Undark, this company's trademark paint. Created from a brand new element. A lady like yourselves discovered it over in France. Now, isn't that something? They gave her the Nobel Prize, honest to God. It isn't dangerous. Give it a taste. A lick of the brush won't hurt you and will make a finer point. Try a little dab on your nails, perhaps your teeth too, to entice a young man in the dark of the picture show. Delights he didn't even know were there. Those aprons all the men are wearing, that's just to keep the paint off their clothes when they mix it up in the warehouse. We men are the real vain creatures, aren't we, girls? Now take your places and get to work. Smile, girls, and glow in the dark for me. There are a couple of different sequences in the book, and one is called Color is an Event, and I'm just going to read one of those. Orange. My children love the taste of orange. They like it flooding chins, the orange juice dripping, sticking, tickling. Orange to flavor chocolate candy, orange to scent their mother's hair. The orange crayon is just a stub. They orange color everything orange. Their teacher stocks special orange chalk for them. They concentrate on orange problems better. Take one orange away from a crate and orange. How many do you have? The orange walls of their room are orange and orange. The neighbors call them sunrise orange and sunset orange. There would be no orange living without their love, and orange, we do what love requires, orange. There's another sequence in the book called Atoms, and they're very, very short poems, each based on an element, and I'm just going to read two of those. The letters led to letters, but every diamond burned into poisonous air and returned to its sender. The little flames of foxes spied us from the dunes. I held my breath in case you needed it. Thought I'd try out a few new poems. You can let me know what you think. This first one takes its title from a John Donne poem of a very similar title that you may know. Good Friday, 2020, going nowhere. The order came, we should not leave the house, and each to stay a burial depth away. But the weather was delightful, and I ached to travel in the light of such a sun. The 100,000 dead said no, to most. The soul refluxes at such a decimation, 2 feet and 4 paws wearing down the path on this good day. The neighborhood tucked in, adopting hours from past times, while I wait for a sign from what? the breathless wind that made the scattering of flowers on the lawn. This is the day the Lord has made, I sang last Sunday via fiber optic cable. My flat tongue atrophied for lack of practice. The greatest loneliness was feeling God no longer wanted anything from you. My newfound travel section destination, the eutrophic retention pond. Its scruffy birds spindle out of the water and leave me, for I am not their responsibility. This is the world that we have made, we know, as we douse ourselves with flasks of sanitizer, the angels' share evaporating in the last heat of the setting sun. I've wished to return west since I left as a child. Another year of denial. Instead, the dog and I make our compass and pace responsible circles in the reddening of the day. A brief quiver of pain from the slight tug of the retractable leash we're both still on. The day after Easter. Today, the redbuds sublimated into wisteria. It was time to burn our accumulations. We missed, again, the disoccupation, grave clothes folded, corks rearranged, the quiet, Mary. Before the roses dishevel, let us carry our ashes into the lake without a bottom. I'm going to read one more, and it is in response to the art installation that was on the National Mall this summer in response to the COVID-19 victims. In America, Suzanne Furstenberg, 9/25/21, 684,428. I wish it wasn't so beautiful, these white flutters learning to breathe under a sky with no roof. So many little surrenders pricking the ground, pulled, then gone, leaving only aerated soil in their wake. Crush me with beauty if that's what it takes. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. That was terrific. That last one was caught me off guard a little. So I just sat there for a second.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, could everyone unmute for just a second, and let's give our readers a nice round of applause.
Yay.
Yay.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are going to hang out, and Gwen will moderate Q&A for anyone else who wants to hang out and ask our readers a question or two.
All right, thank you so much to all of our readers. That was really wonderful. So for the Q&A, if you have any questions for our readers, you have two options. So one, you can go ahead and just pop your question into the chat if you would like, and I am happy to read it. Otherwise, if you'd like to use just the sort of raise hand feature, that'll put a little yellow hand by your hand in the participants list, and I'll just call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. Either way would be great. And I know sometimes it takes a moment to think of what questions we might have for our readers. Something that we've been kind of asking all of our readers since we started this series is, how has the pandemic affected your writing in terms of its content, or even how has the pandemic affected your writing in terms of your process? Because I think that both of those, I know I, as a writer, am very much struggling with both of those things as we go through these strange times. So I'll ask you all that as sort of a kickoff to our Q&A.
Oh, am I going first?
Whoever.
I'll go first. So, and I probably speak for many people here when I say this, as an introvert, the pandemic didn't really affect my life that much because I was still staying home, not going to many places except for the grocery store and walking the dog. But I found that it really did affect my writing. And I wrote, you know, a complete novel, not this one that I just read from, but a different one that hopefully will be published. And I sent it to my agent when it was done, and he was like, this is a really angry book and you need to redo it. So I'm in the process of doing that, and it really gave me kind of a different perspective on the year, that it was, you know, that it really was not the same for me as an introvert, you know, just sitting writing, that it had really affected how I, like, my outlook on the characters and the plot. So I would say, yeah, it really affected me.
Wow, that's so interesting.
I can jump in. By the by, I'm actually working on an article right now for American Theater Magazine. The prompt is, and it's specifically for playwrights, in revisiting your work now, in revisiting your before times writing, have you found anything feels tonally off or different than it would have? You know, we've been off stage now. A lot of these theaters have been dark for 18 months and they're just now getting back to it. And so I've been interviewing writers about this and how they see their writing now. And the mix is just really, really interesting. There's one writer who just completely pulled the show because he's like, I just feel like things are different now. And I don't think that this is the kind of angry play that the world is needing right now for the comeback. And but I have to echo what Suzanne said. I wrote a play during the pandemic. It's maybe the angriest thing I've ever written. and my dramaturg was like, whoa, okay. Remember, there needs to be a soul and a heart and love. I was like, well, you know, I always get to that. That's not always the thing that I lead with, but it's always a thing that's in there. But I just set out to just write this vitriolic kind of lurching of, you know, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, pretty quickly, I would just say that I've heard this question before, and in fact, I work for a school, and they ask sort of earlier in the part of the year, they wanted to know what we learned from the pandemic, and the truth is, when I think about answering the question, I don't have. It's almost like a blank space. It reminds me of, I was watching Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell, and she quotes Margaret Atwood at the beginning. That quote about when you're in the middle of a story, it's not a story at all, but a roaring. It's an event. And for me, it seems like I'm still in it. I haven't fully understood what I've learned from this. I'm sort of enduring, I guess. But I have been grateful that there's been an urgency to finishing this next book and to writing. So I don't quite know, but I do appreciate the question because it has me reflect each time.
I'll just add that, I mean, for me, as far as, you know, the pandemic and what's, I don't know how it's maybe affected me or not. I mean, one thing I never really wrote about, I was never one to write about major events, political events, things that happened right away. Like, that was never something I did. But in this case, I did. I don't know why exactly, but for some reason, I ended up writing a number of poems that related to the pandemic, sort of as it was happening, which was unusual for me. For better or worse, that's what happened.
Thank you all. We have a couple questions in the chat. So this first one is for Mario from Kathleen, and it says, can Mario talk a little more about how and why he uses the palindrome? Thank you, Kathleen.
Of course, and I think the short answer is that I think, like many of us, lucky. I stumbled into it. I think that, like I was trying to mention before, I think the palindrome's pleasure is easily exhausted or extinguished. But there is something sort of pleasure about the pattern and the idea of repetition. And it really only wasn't until, again, it was sort of, I stumbled into this. I have a colleague, terrific teacher and writer and thinker, and he teaches Latin. And we were teaching a course together on color. And we were trying to approach it from the perspective of starting with the myth of Echo and Narcissus. And I was at this moment writing palindromic poems and preoccupied with elegies for the dead, and worried that I was taking this turn in my writing toward what a kind of narcissism, or at least I was afraid of that. And so it wasn't until later that I put together this lecture my colleague gave, which was that in the myth of Narcissus, in the Latin, which I don't read, he says that when Narcissus went to the water in thirst, another thirst arose when he saw his face and was sort of trapped. And the word he uses in Latin is situs, which is a palindrome, S-I-T-I-S. And he's suggesting, I think, that Narcissus makes a palindrome with himself in the water, and he's trapped forever in that. And so it was a sort of blending of my fears and my worries, that I can approach directly this idea of the palindrome, and every palindrome is the shape of Narcissus, as I begins one of the other poems I have. And I'm trying to work within that form, and I'm trying to find a way out. So that's part of, I think, what fascinates me lately about the poem, or about the form. Thank you for asking.
So interesting. Thank you, Mario. We have a question for Audrey from Mia Chard. What draws you to writing about lonely people?
Well, I come by it honestly. I come from therapists. So that's the first thing. In my home growing up, there was always this, let's get it out there. Let's talk about it, you know, and I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm from the South. And I've always been drawn to to ache stories, like Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune, and the plays of Tennessee Williams, even like Beauty Queen of Leanne. Martin McDonough is one of my favorite playwrights. Stories of these lost and lonely people that have an edge to them is sort of what I've always sort of aspired to. The Washington, D.C. region, I don't know if you know this, but it's a very political city. And a lot of the playwrights here, not just here, but definitely here, will use their platform for writing about social and political issues. I've never felt like I was smart enough for that. I try to stick to what I really, really know, which is human nature, human suffering. And so I wouldn't have been able to tell you this maybe even 6 or 7 years ago, but I had to sit down and put together an artistic statement for a grant opportunity. And I started looking at my body of work, and I realized that I do this with every single piece. And only recently actually have realized just how autobiographical some of these ache stories are. So I guess if I'm being fully honest, and maybe the first time I'm saying this out loud, is I think it comes from my own loneliness, my own feelings of increasing anxiety and reclusivity, and the need and desire to want to retreat from the world and to not get hurt anymore. And I have just found that when I write stories like that for the stage, they really resonate with people. I don't think you can ever go wrong when you dig down to those really deep layers of emotional truth in your characters. You can get away with a lot of fuckery and a lot of flaws in your story if you will just get to the heart of it, you know? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Oh, let's see. Oh, Norris. Thank you, Norris. So he says, thank you everyone for these wonderful readings. A question for everyone. What do you think about the role of humor in your writing? Oh, now my thing is refusing to scroll. Sorry. Sorry, everyone. Sorry. We're getting so many new messages that my chat can't even handle this much excitement. I'm going to break this out so I don't have to deal with this.
I can read Norris's question while you make that work.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't know why it's not scrolling for me, Leah.
This is for everyone. What do you think about the role of humor in your writing? I've been watching a lot of stand-up comedy during the pandemic, and I'm wondering what you all think about comedy's place in creative writing.
Well, I'll just say I'm not a very funny poet, but for the most part, I wouldn't mind being funnier. I like humor in poems and in writing in general, and I, in some ways, wish there was more of it, especially in poetry. Um, you know, so when there's a chance to at least do a little bit of humor, when I get a chance to do a little more, I try to do it.
It's funny for you to say you're not funny with that picture of Tigger right next.
It's my stand-in for being funny. Yeah.
You know, I can recall watching Seamus Heaney. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. This was many years ago. I saw him read his part of his poem collection about his mother. And that was one of the first times I realized that, you know, truth is funny. It just is. And, you know, I was crying one minute and laughing the next. And I thought to myself, you know, that's how I want to write. However I can get to that. It's just it's so vital, but I don't think when you try to layer it on, you know, it doesn't really work. At least for me in playwriting for the stage, it's a bit different. You know, it has to come from a place. Not only does it have to sound like natural dialogue, but it also has to, you know, erupt kind of organically in those moments. And I don't know if you guys get this, but the wonderful indulgence, one of the benefits of being a playwright is that you get to witness people live watching your writing on stage, and it's always surprising what people laugh at. Let's leave it at that.
Sorry if none of the rest of you want to weigh in. We have another question if humor is not your bailiwick.
Well, I love the question too, and thinking about comedians. I think I watch as many comedy shows as I can, even more than readings, poetry readings, and I'm fascinated by the way they're able, all kinds of comedians are able to hold a crowd, to build a joke, the silence that's necessary and required, timing. I mean, all of that carries over into writing. And not just, so that's the performance aspect of it, but comedy. I'm thinking about, I watched Hannah Gadsby's Nanette the other day, and she said,
Amazing.
Laughter is not our medicine. It's the honey with which we take the medicine. And I've been thinking about that lately quite a lot. But absolutely find the comic and the comedian and it's at the heart of so many arts. And too, like Jason, I too wish I could include it more. But you know, we shall see. I hope I can live longer and write funny poems. We'll see.
And and I think that humor is really important in fiction. It should be hidden so that, you know, like an Easter egg, so you can just find it. And I think that humor is really difficult to write. I try not to do it too much because my taste in humor is for stupid humor. I really like dumb jokes. 30 Rock is one of my favorite shows and has really gotten me through the pandemic in a lot of ways.
Well, this kind of actually leads into this, and this can be our last question for the night from Jonathan M. Says, apologize if this appears to be a shallow question, which I do not think that it is, Jonathan, but would love to know a TV show or film or book that each of you found comfort in during this awful pandemic. Learning how much Annie Baxter loves Fanny and Alexander somehow taught me much about her and her writing.
I can start, and I don't know how many of you have seen Fleabag, but I was drawn to that because it started out, on the stage. Well, I don't know if it started out on the stage, but it was, on the stage before it came to TV. And that deep, biting, cynical comedy kind of got me right off because I really do love wicked comedy in my plays. But I think where it grabbed me was just how incredibly her inner trauma and the way this protagonist coped with her loneliness and coped with her angst and her proclivities, however you want to label that. I really enjoyed and was blown kind of sideways with the way the whole thing started kind of folding in. Not to give anything away, but I was so incredibly taken by how clean and precise it was. The skill of this woman having written this and then performing in it was such a huge inspiration for me. It really took me by surprise.
That show is incredible. I love it so much.
I'll chime in that there were many shows I watched over the course of the pandemic, but the thing that I always return to for comfort and also just joy, and even back before the pandemic, all my whole life almost, is The Simpsons. I could probably quote most of that to you, at least the first dozen seasons or so, and that never ceases to be a source of entertainment and joy and comfort to me. But also the zoo shows. I binge those every day. All the zoo in the Bronx Zoo, the San Diego Zoo, all those, I could watch that stuff all day.
Sorry to interrupt. Zoo shows?
I
don't watch.
I think it's Discovery Channel. It's like the zoo, and then there's like the zoo, but it's the San Diego Zoo, and then there's the Columbus Zoo, and I think they're all called the zoo.
You gotta get on that zoo cam action when there's a new baby.
Well, what's the little? What's the wonderful little rhinoceros's name in Cincinnati? That one I follow. Is it a rhinoceros?
Oh, Fiona the hippo.
Fiona the hippo.
Our most famous Cincinnati resident.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
In the Cincinnati Review.
Oh,
yeah. Oh.
An AWP giveaway from a few years back.
Nice.
Yes.
I really should have snagged one of those when we had.
I have one. I was not leaving without one.
I find that I'll watch, like during the pandemic, anything that was really escapist. And we watched The Expanse, which is a science fiction soap opera and has 7 or 8 seasons. And it just goes on and on. And, but, it's in outer space. So, you're not here. And the Great British Baking Show, I found, was really helpful.
I love that show so much.
I only recommend one. And I agree to these. I just recommend one that I'm very excited about and being surprised also by a film from the past that is very good and a holiday film, and that is Die Hard. And I'm really looking forward to watching that again. Last year, my wife and I watched that again, and just that got us through the winter. So I would put that's.
Oh my God. Yippee-ki-yay. What an incredible way to end this reading with Die Hard. Thank you all so much. This was really wonderful. And oh my gosh, we even have ZooCam recommendations in the chat for all your pandemic viewing. Thank you to our readers. And thank you all for being here. This is a pleasure. So.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Thank you. Good to meet you. See you all later.